Mark Scott was murdered because of a football team he supported in Glasgow. Nil by Mouth was founded, and David Scott, who runs Nil by Mouth, has a chat with me about what an employer can do to deal with sectarianism in the workplace and on social media. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by David Scott from the charity Nil by Mouth. Nil by Mouth are well, I know of the organisation really well, and I know them because of I'm a committee member of a football team locally, and Nil by Mouth are our main sponsor. They don't pay us a penny, but you have your David Scott, just to know that Nil by Mouth are all over the football strips. But growing up in Glasgow all my life, I've been aware of some of the issues that underpin our society, and growing up as well as I suppose as an Asian man in Glasgow, you get exposed to some things and hear some things, and some of the things that have been related to my race and my ethnicity, but also how people speak to each other. And I get embarrassed sometimes, and I get really embarrassed. So I'm delighted to be joined by David Scott from Nil by Mouth, and we're going to find out a little bit more about the work that his organisation does. So David Scott, thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much, Sean. It's lovely to see you. And we're here on, I think, Monday the 9th of August, as Scotland moves into beyond level 0. So let's hope that we are speaking to each other at the dawn of brighter times for bright work and for Nil by Mouth. It's lovely to be with you today, and I look forward to an interrogation from you with that gentle probing style that you're the Glaswegian Jeremy Paxman, I think is how you've been across.
Well, I suppose that's never been called that before, but I don't think I'll be as intense as Jeremy Paxman, but I'm really interested. So, we've been, or I've been, our business, we just to let everybody know who's listening or watching, we have booked a session with David with Nil by Mouth to learn more about, as an employer, what we need to do. And that's what I really want to talk about as an employer. So if I touch on this, first of all, David, right, and I want the story of Nil by Mouth to open up with. We're a business, and I would think, well, what's that got to do with anti-sectarianism? It's got nothing to do with it. We're here to, run an organisation and recruit people, whatever it may be. So can we just open up? What's the duties here? What do we need to know? What's the responsibilities of a business with regards to what we're trying to do?
Well, that's an excellent question and observation. The history of our organisation, where people tend to think about sectarianism in Scotland, people automatically jump to things such as football, stabbing, violence, aggression. They look at sectarianism. Indeed, when we go to work in primary schools, you get people picturing that, as they see it, as a violent thing, an aggressive thing. And what we've discovered over the 20 or so years that we've been working in this field, particularly since 2010, when we launched a program called Beyond Religion and Belief, which is about talking about sectarianism in the workplace, is the idea of sectarianism in Scotland isn't just football, stabbing, violence. And the actual reality is the majority of sectarianism in Scotland is actually nothing. It isn't violent. It's not about people being killed or murdered or attacked. That happens. Our charity was set up after a young man was murdered, for example, a very, very tragic example of it. But there's a temptation sometimes to just kind of think that these issues, and not just sectarianism, things such as racism, homophobia, all these things, we look at the worst case scenario, which is violence, which is people sadly losing their lives, aggression, and we think, God, that's what the problem is. And we then, I think, on occasions, excuse ourselves, because 99.9% of us will not hit somebody with the head of the bottle. 99% of us won't stab somebody. And we think, isn't sectarianism a terrible thing? Isn't racism a terrible thing? Isn't homophobia a terrible thing? And we start to point the finger and look at, why wasn't somebody doing this? Why wasn't this person apprehended? But there's not that period of reflection when we look at it and actually think about our own attitudes and our own kind of life. And perhaps the kind of iceberg effect that underneath the stuff that garners headlines, the stuff that we see reported on media, the stuff that's shared on social media sites, there is this grimly depressing reality that some people face on a day-to-day existence. Now, Sean, I don't want to delve into your own personal experiences, but you're right. You're an Asian man. You're growing up in Glasgow. We're talking maybe 2 or 3% of the population of Scotland comes from different ethnic minorities. And I would want to presume your experiences, but I'd imagine there's quite a lot of things that people don't bat an eyelid that you may encounter, that people we don't see, perhaps our ears aren't tuned to. We haven't perhaps experienced it. We don't really understand it. And when employers are dealing with it, we went to employers about 2009, 2010, sectarianism was an issue in Scotland. And people were saying, well, it's not really, because it's all football stuff, it's all banter, it's not really something we have here. There was a reluctance to talk about it, partly because people, I think, wanted to bury their head in the sand about it. Also because I think people, again, just saw, they didn't see the use of language as sectarian. They didn't perhaps look at the things such as, the allocation of shifts, or the balance of a workplace, or symbols or emblems or things that were used. Language, of course, being the key thing. And so the highlight was the Equality Act, which was brought in 2010. And that was an effort to try and make sure that everybody got a fair crack. People couldn't be discriminated because you come from Asian background, because I'm Irish, because people are gay, people are pregnant. It was an effort to try and say, look, you can't just treat people differently because of these characteristics. So equality is everyone's business. And one of the things that we would highlight, we work with firms or clients such as your own or what have you, is the Equality Act. So let me give you an example. I was recently doing some work with people who were working in industry. They were working on building sites, and they were a kind of like a partnership organization, a professional body, and they asked us to come in and work with different trainers from sites and what have you. And one of the members said, look, I don't really understand why we're doing this. What's the need of this? Like, what sort of training? And the point I made to them was, look, do you teach your folks health and safety on site? It's the first thing we teach them, but how you use your tools, how you put things where that everyone is safe in a work site. And he said, well, you realize the Equality Act is the same thing. It's about protecting people at work, not protecting them from having things hit over their head. It's making sure that they get the same opportunities, the same prospects, that they're not discriminated against because of a different characteristic to perhaps the majority of people they work with. And he came around to be fair to me, said, I never really thought of it that way. And so what we're trying to do with employers is start a dialogue that actually thinks there's two elements to it as well, HR and PR. All right, human resources things. What are your legal responsibilities in terms of, as an employer, what do you have to make sure? And that can be from interview questions to things that are in shared workspaces, to jobs you might ask employees to do, all those things that matter, to also the kind of HR issue that, for example, you've got an employee who not on their work time, but outside it indulges in sectarian behavior. Say they've got a social media account, for example, and they target prominent people in life. That suddenly becomes a HR issue for you, because the chances are they've signed a contract that actually says that if they bring their employer into disrepute, it could be an issue there. You might be an employer who activates, public sector contracts, and where council, the taxpayer is paying you maybe £1 million, £2 million for a project, and taxpayers come in all wonderful shapes and sizes and types and figures and ways of going, and suddenly the government agency is going to go, well, hold on a second, one of your employees has just been convicted of doing this and doing what have you, and that reflects badly on you. So it's also trying to help employers understand that HR and PR dynamic and navigating that. Sometimes it's about, and it's realizing that actually, for better or worse, the fact that you're now sitting here in one of probably Scotland's leading recruitment kind of firm, talking to me about these sort of issues, means that you're aware that this is a challenge for your clients and things that come in it. That this is very much on the radar of employers, and it needs to be, because people are making, as customers, as stakeholders, people really want to make sure that everyone's been treated fairly in the workplace. And so our work tries sectarianism to bridge that.
So that's really interesting. Sorry to break in there, David, but it's like, to me, we see in our customers' workplaces, for example, and not just ours, our workplace, it's more diverse than it ever was. But what we have found is what I would call this new generation of Scots. So we have people from Lithuania, Poland, Nigeria. Our workforces, our temporary workforce is really diverse. Our own workforce has become really diverse. And what we do see in some customer sites or other sites is that, it's how are people integrating, within how Scottish people integrate with other communities. And I'm going to tell you a story, and as you said to me, is ringing so many bells in my head personally. And then I think about what we're trying to do as a business at Labour, is that it's so important that, now, because we have what I'd say is a bit of a labour crisis going on just now. It's a very, the effects of Brexit, the pandemic have sped it up. There's there's not enough people to fill a lot of the vacancies out there in certain roles, lower paid roles anyway. And we're looking at working with employers to change their proposition. They need to make these places much more attractive to work in for everybody. And also, post-Brexit, as we sit now, we don't have a workforce that's coming or arriving. People aren't coming from other European countries to come and work in Scotland anymore, full stop. So now Scottish people and Scottish people, locals, have to now take on some of these roles. So what we're finding is that to make it more attractive, the employer has to do a lot more and have to really believe it. So you said about HR and PR, that's so true, because the HR problems that we see that some kids can raise, and I mean, if you touched on this is social media, and I'll probably just give you a little bit of a, can we get a little bit more on this if that's okay? Because this is something that's, for me, I've seen it historically with some of our own staff, and some of the things that they post, and some of the most vile, horrible things in the world, and they come into work, and this is historically, and you think, whoa, where did that come from? Oh, it's just a bit of banter, it's a Facebook comment. And you're right, some employers have contracts. So maybe can I just dwell on this a little bit? What's your, how do you feel about, your thoughts on this, about social media and managing that in the workplace? Because it's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, social media has the internet revolutionized our society, and social media has revolutionized our society. And what it also means is it's easy to find people. So, for example, you and I could you have a very distinctive name. All right, I could sit and Google you, and I'm pretty sure I could come up, and I have, and doing research for your show, and I can find your social media profiles and things that are there. Now, you, ever the pro, all right, what we will find is we will find Shan on LinkedIn. And look Shan up on LinkedIn, and Shan will be gleaming, he will be smiling. You're going, what is that man doing in recruitment? He should be hosting a game show. He's like a one-man on deck put together. So Shan will put in his LinkedIn because he's a professional. He will look at it. He will put a LinkedIn profile that will show his strengths, his attributes, the things that he's done, the things that he's picked up on. He will put an online CV there, and you will be the master looking through that. But I'm willing to bet also you're a man who's able to understand when perhaps all the shimmers is not necessarily gold. So I would suspect, like, maybe we did a poll of employers that we work with, and it was a confidential in the sense that I wouldn't compromise the people involved, but they were happy for the findings. So we sort of polled 200 employers at different sort of levels, and we asked them about their social media habits in terms of what we're looking at. Less than 50% of them told us that they looked at a LinkedIn account before they employed somebody. 75% said they looked at your Facebook page. Because what they believe is actually on LinkedIn, you're only going to tell a good side of your story. You're only going to tell a thing that shows you well, the pictures, the things you put across. Facebook is when we think nobody else is watching, even though we know everybody else is watching. So people will put posts and things online, and a lot of recruitment agencies and HR companies will have a good look at your Facebook and Twitter profiles before they consider you for it, because that could show you to be a liability in some case. Now, I know, for example, my organization, we're a small group, 3 staff. When we recruit, I vet people online, because for my organization, if somebody had posted something sectarian, aggressive, hateful, that's going to be hugely damaging for my organization for you to then receive a job. Doesn't mean you can't change attitude, you go on, but if those things haven't been addressed. So what employers are realizing is Facebook is, and also by nature, we're nosy. We like to know what goes on in people's lives. When we do sessions, we ask people, hands up if you've ever looked up a stranger on Facebook, and every hand in the room goes up. And we all do it. We all do it for different reasons. Yeah. Sometimes nosiness, sometimes you might have children who've got friends. A girl of mine actually said, I actually quite fancied a fella in my work. I didn't know, and I looked him up online. But she's being honest. Like, some people go, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. But most of us do. We're social creatures. We're social animals. We interact in this way. Now, this is also brought into issues for employers, because obviously people will interact inside and outside. Sometimes people will use their real names and real titles, so you can identify somebody from their LinkedIn, and you'll find the same pictures on Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat. Sometimes people will use shell accounts. So sometimes they'll use, particularly with Twitter, where Twitter has become a pretty toxic place in the last 18 months or so. People will post things, but of course it is quite easy to find who's doing them. It can go ahead. And it can be posted. Now, we've had issues when employers have came to us with a number of things in recent months. One was a case where a footballer was doing a live stream interview on one of these platforms. One of their employees had gone on and posted something racist about the footballer, a bit of racist abuse towards him, which had been screen grabbed and shared and was off the Sun and the Record in different newspapers showed it in Pan. I got a frantic call from the organisation saying that this is a member of our staff, what do we do, how do we deal with it, because they hadn't thought about the processes for it. They hadn't thought about how social media can impact on that. Now, the member of staff was saying, look, I shouldn't have said what I said, but it was outside of work time, so it's not be an issue for you. But you're looking at the contract, and the contract that the person has signed says, if you behave in this manner, you could lose your job. And so what we've always been trying to do is actually, it's like anything else, you have to prepare for things. And I think it would be a very naive organization that wasn't really aware that social media is probably the biggest challenge facing employers at the moment. Because employers don't want to tell you what to think. They want, you're free. We're free creatures. You're allowed to have political views or footballing views or sporting views. But if an employer, I know I never would, Sean, but I can look you up at this. It's bright work, and bright work, and you're branded, right? You are the face of bright work. Everyone knows you're the guy for bright. And say I find your LinkedIn profile, and then I find your Facebook account, and there's messages about people, and maybe it sometimes is in the Glasgow vernacular. Part of the thing is the football dynamic becomes a bit of a proxy for it. So, well, I'm not really criticizing them for being Catholic or Protestant, but I'm calling them Huns or Fenians or whatever the kind of terminology is, or Orange Bees. But that's just football banter. And sometimes what people don't understand is if you're abusing somebody directly, you don't get to decide what's upsetting them or not. I get people to around and say, didn't mean anything by it, but it's almost irrelevant what you meant by it. It's what people hear and how you make people feel. And too often when we ran this project, we had people said it's just banter. All right. Mm-hmm. And in years gone by, racism was seen as just banter in workplaces. I mean, if you look at some of the television shows in the 70s and 80s, I know you're not as old as me in those ways, but if you look at some of these shows, I once did a session with a group of older guys in the 50s, and I showed them shows like In Sickness and in Health and all this stuff, and they were laughing, oh, this is amazing, but we wouldn't talk about that now. Mm-hmm. But when they were growing up, that was how their language was. And you made a great point earlier about a new generation of people coming into the workforce. People are very sure of their rights, and they're very sensitive to things, and they want to take things up. And when you start work, you're starting at 16, 17, and you can work with people all the way to 60. Now, if you think about how the world was as somebody was 60, was leaving school, the attitudes, the values, things that were now legal in society that were illegal then. So work is also a place where generations come together. And there's also there can be clashes in those things about people who think, that language you're using, you're saying it's banter. It's not banter. It's not acceptable to me. It's not how I've ever been spoken to. You get older people going, well, I don't mean anything by it. And sometimes actually they just use silly language. I've had to work with people who on some occasions have been disciplined for, sectarian abuse. And yet they're actually married to somebody from that very self-same background.
It's mad. It's mad. I suppose you're touching on something. Do you know what it's like to me? I mentioned earlier on, I grew up in Glasgow, and you see the football, and it's classed as banter. And that's the thing, is you just mentioned what people could have said, or what people did say years ago when it comes to race. You can't, you just know you can't, and I've seen a shift change, I would say, in how people and generally in society probably talk, in some of those languages. But what I've not seen in that is in this banter, this football banter, if you like, which can cause this, which does cause this massive offence. And it's like, how do you, so how would you, if somebody's using these words and what they think is related to the old firm, right? And how do you tackle that member of staff? So you've maybe seen something that's been posted on Facebook, post Rangers Celtic, right? And or pre or whatever it may be. And you can see the language, and it makes you feel sick to the stomach. So how do you tackle it? You come into work on Monday, what do you do?
Yes, and I mean, this is the thing people get, because sometimes it's a confidence issue because on occasions in the west of Scotland, there has been a kind of permissive environment built up around sectarian language. And sometimes that becomes at football, and people will say, look, we use these words, but actually we don't mean anything by them. Which I've never kind of agreed with. It's like sometimes people will tell me I'm a 90-minute bigot at a football match, and you think, well, are you a 90-minute racist? Do you go to a football match and abuse someone because of the colour of their skin or where they come from? Some people will try and use that, but civic society doesn't use that excuse. They don't say, so it's that kind of element we've got to think about it. And the difficulty also is, you'll be familiar. You'll know people in the west of Scotland. We run a kind of thing about, I guess it's about kind of stereotyping people. So when you're looking at people from a HR perspective, what do people look at when they judge somebody to do a job? And say someone in the HR department might have attitudes. So we look at things like people's email addresses. So for example, if people have email addresses, say 1888, the year Celtic were founded, or 1690, the Battle of the Boyne, or 1916, the East Rising, things that are sporting or culturally part of that person. That may change how you perceive them, because you might think, oh, that's some of my tattoos people might have, the schools that people might go to. These are ways of making judgments, which I also add are not always correct. You know what I mean? Dates like 1888, 1690, these are dates where things happen. You know, in themselves, they're not sectarian. You know, they're just dates when things have happened that are related to cultures and identities. But a big issue would be how confident people feel about identifying this behaviour. One of the things we've started with is working with modern apprentices and restarts in local authorities, because I think they find it easier, you know, to go at the very basic, you know, starting point and saying, look, you're starting work for the first time, these are the things that are expected of you. But of course, that doesn't work if people have been in the employer workplace 20 or 30 years. It doesn't work if it has to be a very leadership-led culture in that way, that you have to sort of think, how would my boss deal with this? You know, because would my boss have my back if I pull this up and talk this in a certain way? And sometimes a quiet word with people, say, look, I saw this posted online. Do you really think that's the best thing to do? And they might turn around and say, look, that's my opinion. It's my private life. It's got nothing to do with it. And that's never pleasant. I mean, these are difficult conversations to have with people. I don't always think disciplinary action is the best, you know, is the most appropriate action in every case, because there's a temptation sometimes to say, someone has posted this, someone has said it's discipline them. There's also a chance for education. A lot of the work we do is with individuals who have made mistakes in their workplace. And what we've tried to say to the HR departments is, look, if you're concerned about having these conversations, but you're worried about something, go and speak to your external partners. In Scotland, there's so many organisations, a whole raft of equality groups who want to help, who want to kind of take that off your shoulders and encourage you. And we can have all the best policies in the world, but it comes down to like human resources. How do you manage other people? And it sometimes has to be a case-to-case basis when you turn around and think, I can talk to that person, I can't talk to that one. And also a breach of it where you think, well, this is a, so if someone's posted a one-off element, but the rest of their social media stuff you think is quite normal. You think this is a mistake, we shouldn't have done it, I'll need to keep that noted for a later date. But if you're seeing a pattern of behavior, then you're thinking this could be an issue for me, because another problem we encounter is when somebody is charged under a religiously aggravated offence, which is the one it normally is, that tends to be reported in a newspaper and in the media and by a court reporter, and 9 times out of 10, the employer's name, who the employer's working for. And an even more difficult thing is the idea that we've had cases where someone has posted something on Twitter or Facebook or behaved in a certain way. All right, so with a case a couple of years ago, an individual went down to England to watch the team play, heavily intoxicated, running through the town, singing a lot of aggressive, provocative, sectarian songs, being recorded doing it. And I see by the Monday morning, that organisation that person worked for had something like 100 complaints from members of the public, because someone had spotted that person, identified them. If you think how social media works in terms of being tagged and things in it, and so by Tuesday, that individual had to resign. SPT recently had a similar situation where a member of staff had clearly, well, certainly from the content of their social media stuff, had a weekend of heavy drinking and was posting all sorts of sectarian things online. And actually on the Sunday evening, SPT put a little tweet saying, like, we've been made aware of this member of staff has been talked to and has been disciplined from it. So what's happening is your behavior outside of work has been brought into the workplace with you. And for some employers, that's a terrifying thing, because they're like, look, we pick berries, we pack computers, we file things. You know, this is what we do as an organization. We don't care what you do in your private life as long as it's not criminal. But of course, this behavior can be criminal. This, under the Equality Act, under the religious aggravation, you can be prosecuted for these sorts of things. So a lot of it is about, it's a very, very long-winded way to answer your question. There is no one set solution to it. The key things are, do you have the policies? So look at your policies and what do your policies tell you, all right? Turn around and say, if someone behaves in a certain way, are they open to disciplinary action? You know, a lot of contracts now will have some sort of social media clause or code of conduct in that. 2, thinking about how well do you illustrate these policies? Because you must have it too, Shannon. There's so many good policies we have, but do we actually know what the policies are? Do people actually read their contracts? So in what manners are you illustrating these policies to people? Are you bringing folk in every year or so for a little training and an update and saying to them, look, just so you know, this is where the law is. These are some examples of things. 3rd, who are your external partners? Okay, so if you've got an issue like that, you want to raise awareness of something in a workplace. Like, it's not uncommon for someone in the situation you've described to say, look, we've had a member of staff who's posted stuff online. Other people are aware of it. All right, this is causing a bit of tension. And so they would bring a group like Nil by Mouth in to do a talk, to speak to people, to think about possible consequences. And we illustrate that idea about the Equality Act about the HR and PR angle, about your responsibilities to your employer and your employer's responsibilities to you, and just try to make people think in that way without singling an individual out. But that idea is saying that, look, this is a standard that's expected of you. And if the individuals who've attended those sessions fall short of that, well, then as an employer, you've gone, well, look, we've made steps here to try and address this behavior, and it's not been acted upon. In those ways. So it's a multifaceted thing. A lot of it comes down to the fact, how confident do you feel dealing with the person? But of course, you might necessarily know the person. You might be working as a HR executive in a group, maybe 300 people, and it all ends up on your desk. So it's a really difficult one to kind of answer categorically.
It sounds like it's not a case of dealing it by case scenario. It's having a policy there to guide you as a business, making sure that policy is well illustrated and communicated on a regular basis, and also the follow-up. So as you mentioned earlier on through that, Davey, is that you could say, well, I said, can I have a word with you about that? That's this, and having that word, or actually it might create, if it's a pattern, how do you tackle that in different ways? So it's actually not one size fits all, but making sure that there's something there for your own, I suppose a policy there to back you up, and it's living and breathing, and it's constantly being updated, and as the world changes, I suppose you're using that to follow up on. I'm going to maybe just flip around a little bit here, because I want to ask you something. So I'm not making this about this. A personal experience is always important, I think, to get people motivated. I don't think there's anyone who will listen and watching that hasn't witnessed or heard or said or been involved or whatever it may be in some sort of sectarian behaviour in Scotland, and I think that's quite clear. But what I'd say is, two things really rocked me when I was younger, two incidents, and I know this is kind of, I'll go back to the history and all my mouth, but Stephen Lawrence was murdered. It shocked me, it shocked my family, my mum, my mum even to this day talks about it, but I was a similar age to Stephen Lawrence at the time, and I know that even my mum said, no, you're not going out tonight, you're not staying in, I was getting into my teens, and it was quite worrying, and as a family it was quite tense, and it's horrible to watch, and then all in the following years to come, and also the murder of Mark Scott, where Not My Mouth, how it was founded, and I watched that unfold. Not my arms are pointing out the window here to the east, to the eastern part of the city, but I just think that itself was horrific. It was horrible, and something was done, and they came together. It was a kind of moment for me. When you see the timings and everything, it was awful. It was kind of embarrassing. I felt for the first time, being British, I suppose, being Scottish, being a Glaswegian, all of these things kind of gets compounded. And oh man, is it that bad out there? So can just a little bit about, Dave, if you don't mind, about the history of Not My Friend, and doesn't know, and a bit of the background and what
well, as you quite eloquently put there, Shan, Melt My Mouth was the product of a very horrific event that took place in 1995, when a 16-year-old boy called Mark Scott was murdered coming back home from a football match in the city. And often so John Curtis, the eminent pollster, once did like a survey into attitudes to sectarianism in Scotland. I think it was 2015, and he found out 88% of people felt that football was the prime driver to sectarianism. Now, I actually don't agree with that. That's what people kind of perceive. And part of it is events and things that happen to Mark, because I think sectarianism to a lot of people in most vivid form can be at football matches with the chant, the noise, the antagonism, and of course Mark's tragic murder. Mark was a Celtic supporter. He was walking back home. His killer identified him by the colour of his scarf as belonging to a different religious tradition to him. All right, and because he came from that background, he didn't attach the same value to his life. He felt he could treat him whatever way he wanted. He was almost brought up in an environment, Jason, where he was encouraged to hate. That people who were different to him were seen as inferior. He was almost bred to do what he did that day, tragically. And Mark was stabbed to death by a man he never met. And it wasn't even after. The thing is interesting, when you see that reported a lot these days, Sean, they say it was after an Old Firm fixture, but it wasn't. And even those sorts of things, it said they were playing Partick Thistle, so Rangers weren't on the scene. Jason Campbell, who was his murder, had some pretty horrific views drummed into him. He had a family background that were linked to paramilitary groups in my native Northern Ireland. He came from a kind of environment where difference was despised. I think sectarianism, the root of all these things is, how do we respond to things that are different to us? And do we want to learn about it? Do we want to understand it? Do we want to cold shoulder it? Or do we want to stab it, hit it, attack it, latch out at it? And tragically, in this case, that was the choice that was made. And I think it's fair to say that it was something at the time that changed how a lot of people perceived this issue. And there was a lot of murmurings within civic society about doing something about it. The two catalysts for it were, one, his friend Cara Henderson, who set the charity up, felt that not a lot had changed around it. So she sent a letter to the Herald after Donald Finlay, a QC, was filmed singing a number of sectarian songs at an event, and her argument was that my friend lost his life 4 years ago to this attitudes, and here we have somebody who's intelligent, the QC, standing up and down singing these songs. What are we going to do about it? And as a kind of Greta Thunberg of her day, Cara just almost, she would tell you naively, wanted to do something. So she set a campaign up with the aim to get, in this first instance, football clubs to do something in and around the attitudes. And she was met with support in some quarters, hostility in others. The key thing, I think, was also this devolution arriving in the Scottish Parliament, because I think what that brought was a unique focus on Scottish issues that just couldn't happen normally, when it was just the Westminster Parliament. So I think devolution helped. That Jack McConnell got behind the campaign. He brought a summit together where he brought all different people with an involvement and an interest into the room to get talking about it, and some sort of political action took place from it. Then what we sort of found nail by mouth was people just thought it was football stabbing violence, and you realize, well, at what point, like, where the attitude starts? It starts at home, it starts in the school, it starts in push. This attitude of toleration. All right. Now, we were chatting before we started here, Shan. We were talking about your parents were Sri Lankan. Was it both your parents?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, both my parents.
Whether they were immigrants to Scotland.
Yeah. So my parents grew up in Sri Lanka. They studied in Moscow. Would you believe? They met in Moscow. They lived in Ireland, in Castlebar, and had the first civilian registration in Castlebar for over 200 years or something like that. And then they lived in Dublin and moved to Glasgow in the early 70s. There's a BBC series in there alone, never mind a podcast about this wonderful child. But I would imagine the experiences that your parents have had, coming here, and the way that they dealt with things may be very different from yours. And so what you kind of find is generations find their voice, and perhaps a younger generation is keener to speak out, to talk on things, to act on things. And so all those sorts of elements of things became issues, and nail by mouth getting involved. And so a lot of our work is about trying to find people, find a voice, and find action, be that in their communities, be that in their families. Because sectarianism, it happens in workplaces, but like Mark's story is horrible and tragic, and his parents. See, the other thing of this thing is Mark's parents. Mark went to both a Catholic and non-denominational school. Mark's mother was a Catholic, his father was Church of Scotland, right? Mark Scott, by everyone's account, was not somebody he saw an us and then he saw a we. He saw people together. And that was, I think, what really hammered home was this young guy who was a product of what for reasons beyond comprehension, we still call mixed marriages, people from different cultures marrying. But even today, like even not that long ago, Shannon, I had a girl come to my office and said, look, can you come and speak to my dad? Because I'm getting married in 3 weeks and he's not going to walk me down the aisle because I'm marrying someone from a different religion, and things about telling people who they can and can't fall in love with, almost dictating terms over the faith of the school that a child is brought to. It's sad. I actually know grandparents who haven't seen their grandchildren because they disagree with the religious background or even the football teams or whatever that their parents have let them support. So you have all these things. Some of the stuff, like Mark, you can measure in brutal, grim fatalities, the grimmest, nastiest statistic of them all. But underneath it all is all this stuff that Cara was trying to say, this builds up towards this. You can't just pay attention. Stephen Lawrence was a massive thing, right? It was something that sticks. I was listening to Sir Jeff Palmer from Harriet Watt discussing an event recently. We did a Four Nations event with Stephen's brother Stuart. I should call him the Right Honourable Stuart Lawrence because that's his title. As the story was made a lady, and and you sort of still think all these years on, that still sticks in your head. You remember his face. You remember the trial.
The difference in some ways, I never think the Lawrence family got justice. The Scott family got a degree of justice because the killer was caught and put into prison. But the changes are still the same, because you know what? There was racism the day before Stephen Lawrence was attacked. There was racism the minutes after Stephen Lawrence was attacked. It wasn't all stuff that would garner headlines. It could just be like something, and I'm willing to wager, Shannon, again, I don't want to get personal, that you may have walked into a front door, gone out with somebody, and you'll have seen a parent's face just fall, thinking, oh dear God, what have they brought home? You know, and forgive me, but that, you know, and how, as a young guy going through the door, how does that make you feel? How does that make you go on? That doesn't get headlines. I can't measure broken hearts for you, or broken job opportunities, or employment tribunals. I can't measure these things and quantify them. My goodness, they are there, and we have seen them, and we know them, and we have a moral and economic, a legal responsibility to do something about that. And that's why I hope working with things like this, and people listen to that. And I mean, I thought about your broadcast on modern slavery, and you know, we have a stereotype of what slavery is, and the things that you were talking about with the Justice Minister at the time. I was thinking, my God, I'd never thought that these could be like nail bars and things would be places for it. So it's almost constantly re-educating yourself, thinking about things, being engaged with the outside world and what's going on, and not realizing that for some of us, you know, things have always been this way and they always will. So I think that's the thing, always been interested in what's going on outside. And what No By Mouth exists for is to give people a voice and to give people an outlet. And there's a lot of people will shout and scream and be aggressive towards us. And what's fascinating though, the social media feeds, if you go to the Twitter feed, the stuff is quite poisonous and quite angry. And then you point, people shout and complain about it. Go to Facebook, it's different, because on Facebook, people pretty much have to use their own names. While on Twitter, they can use anonymous sort of names. So there's also an element of deep down folk. A lot of folk don't want to put their names to stuff that they're saying, and that I think is quite revealing about a mindset as well.
It's kind of like how social media, isn't it? They can hide behind this frontier. Well, you know, we've covered a lot, and I think, you know, at the core of one thing you've said there, which is going to come to a close here, David, is just really, really wrong with me, and I think it's just about business. So, you know, we're talking to businesses and understanding that, you know, there's more than just profit, but you talked about those three things together: moral, economic, and legal obligations. And economic and legal kind of fall into their own guidelines and pathways, but the moral part of a business, that's the kind of, and that's what can shape a business, can shape the culture. And you mentioned earlier on leadership and coming from the top and the generations of workers, and you know, and all of these things together, but actually, you know, leading them in a moral and ethical way, and having a business that's sound. This does have sound morals, and every business will have issues or concerns or something where they've tripped up, or somebody does trip them up, and that's what happens. But it's actually taking the right path. So, you know, you've really covered a lot, and I think there's so much more we could talk. I think we could probably talk for a couple of hours, Davey. It was fantastic. And I'm delighted that you're going to be running a course for us here at Brightwork in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to have a good attendance there, and it's our first step to taking that, addressing our workers to say, you know, this is something that's out there. Let's work together to do something about it. So you've been a fantastic guest in the Brightwork podcast. I'm delighted that you've taken the time to talk to us. Please, you know, I'm sure we'll cross paths again. Please, I'm sure another conversation maybe due soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'll see you soon for a Diet Coke.
Diet Coke it is. Thanks now.